Okay, here we go. Last leg, people. Stick it out. Stick it out. Keep doing your quizzes. Do your last writing assignment, and just keep watching these videos. Now, today we're going to talk about the Kennedy administration in the election. I've already posted onto D2L the Nixon-Kennedy debates. It's the first televised presidential debate that there ever was. Before, they did some radio debates before, but this is the first televised. There's a couple things, and your text mentions this. Nixon was entirely unprepared for this new technology, whereas John F. Kennedy wasn't. He was very prepared. Kennedy shows up with a makeup artist to basically make his face not have shadows and to cover up his 5 o'clock shadow, and he wore a dark black suit that wouldn't have shadow pockets. When you look at Kennedy, who looks sharp, and then you look at Nixon, who you can almost see his 5 o'clock shadow. He's wearing a gray suit, so every time the light hits it, it makes it look like a crumpled old suit. He almost looked like a hobo. Quickly, before the next debate, Lincoln has him. Kennedy, who's the other guy? The not a crook guy. Nixon. Nixon has him a public relations director. Nixon has him somebody who does his on-camera makeup and things like that. And he has a wardrobe consultant. Somebody who tells him what his clothes are going to look like on black and white television. Okay? Nixon loses the election to Kennedy. Kennedy is going to be elected president in 1960. Now, one of the most interesting things about Kennedy and his administration, I've talked to historians before, and we've talked about the presidents who have the most written about them. The presidents who have the most written about them. You think of people like Lincoln, of course. George Washington has an enormous amount written about him. But somewhere really up high on the list is John Kennedy. Enormous number of books written about John Kennedy. And the most amazing part of this significant event, of this idea, is that John F. Kennedy only serves as president for 3 years. He doesn't even serve a full term. Okay? The thing about Kennedy's presidency, when Kennedy becomes president, he runs on a, as you can watch when you see the debate, when you watch the debate on YouTube on the D2L page, Kennedy's running. He's campaigning on domestic policy issues. He's campaigning on domestic policy issues. However, as soon as he gets in office, he is bombarded by any number of foreign policy questions. Okay, he has crisis after crisis after crisis. And so Kennedy's entire 3-year administration is going to be made up of him putting out international fires and coming face to face and toe to toe with the Soviets, with the Soviet Union, all over the world. Okay, all over the world. I do want to plug this real quick. It's a film series. Greg Kinnear, is it in screen? Greg Kinnear. This is a mini series that came out. I can't remember where it was. Reel's channel is where it came out to cinema. It's about the Kennedy family, and it goes all the way back to World War II when Joe Kennedy was possibly looking towards running for the White House, and it goes all the way through the Kennedy assassinations, and it's an excellent, excellent series on the Kennedys, which I would heartily recommend if you can find this to get access to it, because it's very, very good. What's that? Yeah, we need to. We're going to watch it too. I'm going to make my kids watch it. After this, after these videos on the first part of the Kennedy administration, I'm going to post a number of his televised speeches. This is the thing about Kennedy. When Kennedy's administration starts, we're able to have video documentation for almost everything that happens. Every one of Kennedy's public speeches were broadcast on television. So even the most severe crises, I can't find it. I know it's out there somewhere. There's even one where John F. Kennedy recommends to the country that they start building personal fallout shelters. He gets on television and announced tax incentives, tax breaks for people who are willing to build their own fallout shelters. In the Eisenhower administration, they were looking towards building enormous public shelters, and at which point, when they started crunching the numbers, realized there's no way the government could provide shelters for all the people. And Kennedy's administration starts putting out these civil defense plans to show people how to build a fallout shelter and what to prepare it with, what to stock. I guess technically you could say that it's in the Kennedy administration, we start the whole prepper culture, right? We start this whole prepping culture. And it gave people the feeling that they were doing something, So what we're going to talk about in the first set of videos, we're going to talk about Kennedy and his the three primary crises that Kennedy encounters in the early part of his presidency. Then we're going to talk about Kennedy and the and his involvement in Vietnam, how things start to escalate and how Kennedy starts to draw them down. And then the last video we're going to talk about is Kennedy's assassination. What's all the hoopla? You know, what are some of the issues related to why a conspiracy, etc., etc. And then what would it mean? What would it mean about the government if there was this massive cover-up of the Kennedy assassination? So we've got a lot of things to cover as far as Kennedy before we can get into Johnson and hit the Vietnam War head on. Now, Kennedy's administration goes from 1961, 1963. Again, he ran against Richard Nixon. Kennedy, the whole country believed that with Kennedy's inauguration, we are entering a new stage, right? They refer to it as Camelot, basically talking about the Summer Kingdom. Of those of you familiar with the Arthurian legends, when King Arthur comes to the throne, it's the new Summer King, and everything is going to change now. Everything's going to be beautiful and wonderful. Well, at his inauguration, Kennedy shocks everybody by basically telling the world that within 10 years, we are going to put a man on the moon and safely bring him home. Now, in the Eisenhower administration, we already lost the space race in getting a rocket in the upper atmosphere and even getting a person out of the atmosphere. During the Kennedy administration, however, Kennedy is going to push our country to do things that at that time we did not even have the technological capability of doing. So in Kennedy's inaugural address, he starts pushing, he starts making promises and saying, we need to strive for this. Many people believe that it was just a pipe dream, but I believe that Kennedy actually challenged the nation. I believe Kennedy thought that this country was of such a character that when we see this challenge in front of us, we can meet the challenge. And I think that's what he did by drawing that line. And he drew the line all the way up on the moon. And he said, we will safely bring a man home from the moon. So from that point forward, NASA starts working on trying to find a way of accomplishing a moonshot. Now, Kennedy's administration, Kennedy, like the presidents before him and like the presidents after him all the way to Reagan, are Cold War presidents. They have to deal. Most of their foreign policy decisions are driven by NSC 68. Each one of these presidents is going to apply this doctrine of containment differently. Kennedy has a very sort of common sense, logical approach to the concept of how do we stop the spread of communism. He says the only way to stop the spread of communism is to win people's hearts and minds. You have to win their hearts and minds, because if they don't trust you and they don't believe you, they're wide open for the opposite agenda. So, some of the crises that we have to deal with in the early Kennedy administration. The first three are the ones we're going to talk about. The rest of them are things that Kennedy had to deal with that we're just not going to have the time to deal with. Okay. The first is the Bay of Pigs, the invasion by the Cuban nationals to try to spark a revolution in Cuba and oust Castro, who just got into office a few years earlier in the Eisenhower administration. The second thing is the Berlin crisis, where the East Germans, under the leadership of the Soviet Union, starts building the Berlin Wall, to cut West Berlin off from the rest of the Western world. And the third major crisis that we have to deal with is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Where the Russians start putting clearly offensive weapons of mass destruction in Cuba pointed at the United States. Some of the missiles were large enough to be able to reach any city in the northern hemisphere, or in the western hemisphere, the northern part of the western hemisphere. So these three crises are the ones we're going to deal with. But there were other issues. The nuclear test ban. Just like Eisenhower, Kennedy attempted to negotiate with Khrushchev in order to get a nuclear test ban. Kennedy believes early on that this is going to be possible. He believes Eisenhower had done things that got him an international black eye, but Kennedy believes he's going to be able to successfully accomplish this nuclear test ban. Vietnam. This is something that Kennedy inherits from Eisenhower, and he is going to have to decide how to do it. South Vietnam is our ally. Matter of fact, Kennedy is one of the senators on Foreign Relations Committee who vets Diem, the South Vietnamese president. He's one of the ones who has contact with him repeatedly because he's living in Boston at the Holy Cross College in Boston. We have to deal with NASA. Kennedy makes that promise that we are going to go to the moon and safely bring a man home. And so Kennedy is going to push. He's going to push hard and spearhead getting NASA the funding it needs to accomplish this task. Kennedy is also president with the advent of the Peace Corps. Now, most people don't think of the Peace Corps as a Cold War measure. But what you have to understand, Kennedy's philosophy about dealing with communism. You win the hearts and the minds of the people. If you go into an impoverished third world area and you teach them how to have clean water, and you teach them how to do more sound structures, you teach them how to have better agriculture, you provide them with a new medical assistant, the Peace Corps goes into these areas in an attempt to win the hearts and the minds of the people. That's not what the Peace Corps tells you today, but that's what the Peace Corps was created for. That's why the Peace Corps was sent all over the world to these third world parts, because we don't want them falling to the communists. Also, the Green Beret, these special operations soldiers are going to become, Kennedy relies heavily on these special forces soldiers, especially in Vietnam, because they are the teachers. They go to other countries and they train the armies of the other countries. Okay, so these Green Berets, these educators, well, they're soldiers. They're teaching you how to be a soldier, but they are educators also. Now, and one thing I don't have on here, it's during the Kennedy administration, we start a program called Radio Free Europe. Radio Free Europe. It's the communist regimes have have shut down radio stations that would be sort of oppose their policies and ideals. Radio Free Europe is going to start broadcasting into on the other side of the Iron Curtain from the western side. They start broadcasting the the news and the music and the things, so that the people behind the Iron Curtain have a source of news. They have to hide these transistor radios and everything, but it becomes something that's significant during this time period. Now, the Bay of Pigs. In January 1961, Eisenhower had cut diplomatic ties with Cuba completely. Castro had refused to get rid of the communists. When we refused to give him money, he tries to get oil refined from the American oil companies. When the American oil companies told him that the United States had told them not to do it, Castro nationalizes the oil fields, and Castro converts Cuba into a communist regime with Khrushchev waiting in the wings, just waiting. And so Khrushchev and the Soviets are there to render any kind of assistance to Castro that they need. Okay, the CIA starts training the Cuban exiles. All of the Cuban exiles who had left when Castro starts converting to communism, the CIA's been training them for a while. Okay, now some people believe that Kennedy was surprised by this, that Kennedy had no idea. But this is Kennedy prior to his election. Okay, prior to his election. Once it comes down to the two candidates, Kennedy and Nixon, these two individuals who are both prominent members of the Congress, and Nixon had been the vice president, they know these three men. These three men are the leaders of this army that's supposed to go into Cuba to depose Castro. Okay, so Kennedy already knows about this. He knows about the plan, and for the most part, Kennedy's in agreement with the plan. If we can send these troops, these 1,500 men, into Cuba, and these men will agitate the people to such a point that they will rise up against Castro, then they can have their coup without the United States being officially involved. And that's the basic plan. They're going to have this coup without us being officially involved. Kennedy's not surprised. Kennedy knows all about this plan. What he doesn't know is how the plan's going to be executed, because it's going to be executed poorly. Kennedy is aware, approves of the mission. This is Havana, where the presidential palace is. Down here is the Bay of Pigs. You can see it's a nice large bay. The troops are going to be leaving from here in Central America, and they're going to be sailing across to the Bay of Pigs. While this is going on, while they're making their way towards the Bay of Pigs, there's going to be air raids along this area in the pineapple banana plantations in an effort to draw Castro's army this direction. And these guys believe they're going to sneak up into the Bay of Pigs and sneak in and be able to march on Havana with little military opposition. So what happens? Well, the idea is we're going to incite these people to rebellion. The people are sick of Castro, the CIA has told Kennedy. He said all they need is some spark, something to show them that they've got a chance to get rid of Castro, and they will rise up against him. And so that's what Kennedy was banking on. Now Kennedy told them, if this thing goes poorly, if this thing goes badly, we cannot provide you with air support. We cannot send the Navy to rescue you. We cannot provide air support to take care of this stuff. So Kennedy informs it, and the CIA and the military, all his advisors, say, well, of course, Mr. President, this is all the Cuban people. This is all the Cuban people. And so on the 15th of April, 1961, the airstrikes start. Okay, old U.S. ships that have been given over to this Cuban Liberation Force. The paint job on the airplanes are they're so bad you can still see the American insignia coming through the cheap paint job that was done on them. And so these planes are going to try to bomb these plantations. What happens is they fail miserably. They fail miserably. And then the second they miss their marks, they don't start the fires that they're supposed to. And so in some cases, the bombing raids almost go unnoticed. The second big problem with this invasion, which causes some people to think there was sort of a conspiracy involved here, is that on the 17th of April, the 1,511 exiles will arrive in the Bay of Pigs on their 4 rented boats. 2 of them are yachts. 2 of them are large yachts. And then the CIA had given them 2 landing craft to carry all their equipment. All of their heavy equipment, all of their heavy weapons are being carried on these 2 landing craft. Okay? For a military operation, this was a fiasco from the beginning. Because on the 17th of April is the night of a full moon. People know that you don't invade in a full moon, because in some cases it might as well be daylight. It might as well be daylight. But that's when they went, which caused some people to have this kind of idea that what these folks were looking at when they looked at Kennedy was they thought of him as a kid. They thought of him as somebody who could be handled, and they thought of him, if they back him into a corner, they could force him to do things that he didn't want to do. So they send this invasion, according to the conspiracy theorists, during a full moon with poorly trained pilots who miss their mark and things like this, so that when Castro and his men, the 20,000 Cubans who are waiting for them on the beach, because Castro knows they're coming. He already knows they're coming. And there he sits in one of the tanks, waiting for these guys to land. When the initial conflict starts on the beach, 90 of the exiles are killed in this in the firefight that takes place, and they're without their weapons. Their heavy weapons are on those landing craft. The landing craft are shot out of the water by Castro's tanks almost immediately. Almost immediately. The rest of them are captured, and messages will be sent to the United States to ransom their family members. They will be held hostage, and this is how Castro is going to get money. Now, that conspiracy theory idea. This is what happens. This is what happens when Kennedy finds out that it's a fiasco. Everybody around him starts pushing Kennedy to send the Navy and the Air Force to rescue these guys. You can't send them in there and leave them. I didn't send them in there. You sent them in there. You told me that the people would rise up. You told me that the Cuban army would be deceived. You told me that this was a done deal. We had an agreement. No Navy, no air support. You can't just let them die. You can't just let them... I believe the Army, knowing it was tactically inadvisable to send that group, believed that Kennedy was a young kid that they could force into invading Cuba. That's just me. That's just me. I don't know. This is how it looks. This fits the evidence, because that's what they tried to do. They tried to get Kennedy to invade Cuba, to rescue those 1,400 men with American soldiers, with the American Navy, with the American field cannons from the ship, with the American Air Force. Kennedy wouldn't do it. Kennedy wouldn't do it. He realizes that since Cuba is such a staunch ally at this point of the Soviet Union, Kennedy is not going to take the chance of sending troops into Cuba and giving Khrushchev the chance to talk about American imperialism. He's going to say this American imperialist plot, but Kennedy didn't give him the chance to actually have evidence, because Kennedy won't send anything. People still can't stand John F. Kennedy to this day, because he did not go and rescue the people in the Bay of Pigs. Well, he does, however, rescue these prisoners of war. He does rescue these prisoners of war. He forces private groups in the United States are going to ransom all of these soldiers that are held in Cuba. Many of these private groups are actually backed by the CIA's own slush fund. Kennedy makes the CIA help to ransom these people back, and eventually, my clicker died on me. Eventually, my computer died on me. Well, eventually Kennedy is going to get these people, and they are all going to meet in the Orange Bowl. They're going to have this reunion in the Orange Bowl. Jackie's going to come, and if I could get my PowerPoints to work, I could show you pictures of all of them being in. There it is. Come on, come on. Don't know what's wrong with this thing. There we go. These guys, now, as I said before, Kennedy was aware of the plans because he met the three leaders, and here they are. The same three men that we see in that earlier picture with Kennedy, right? And this guy in the black suit, who's probably the CIA guy, who does it. At this place, Kennedy gives a speech to the 2506th Cavalry that's supposed to have liberated Cuba. That one day, this imprisoned island of Cuba will be liberated. And on that day, you will be there. You will be at the forefront of this liberation. Again, Kennedy goes a long way in trying to make this right with those guys, and at this point, it actually, for Kennedy, this becomes an international black eye. Khrushchev is going to use this to try to beat up Kennedy the same way his own advisors tried to beat him up.